Good morning, everyone. So I'll be talking about the upgrade of our gyrokinetic simulation code called GYSELA towards D-shaped geometries. The meaning of D-shape will be explained very early if it's not clear for everyone. So I'll start with the general modeling of fusion plasma. What is fusion? How do we model this? I'll continue then with the implementation of a geometry in GYSELA, so introducing GYSELA itself and what exactly that notion of geometry means. And I'll finish with first early results, since it's still a work in progress. So sun in a box is a kind of cliche sentence that is sometimes used to refer to magnetically confined fusion. So the nuclear fusion reaction requires overcoming the Coulombian repulsion between protons. So it requires very high temperature of the order of 100 million degrees. In this condition, whatever gas you start from is going to become a plasma, which can be contained using a magnetic field, which is very advantageous because, as you can imagine, you don't want a 100 million Kelvin plasma to touch the wall of whatever reactor you have. So the magnetic field is used to constrain the movement of particles, since they have to circle around the magnetic field lines that allows containing them inside of the reactor. So there are two main strategies for reactor design. One is called tokamak, so it's rather simple donut-like shape. And another one is called stellarator, which is a much more complex one where the donut has been twisted in various ways. So in this presentation, I'll be mostly focusing on tokamaks. And so when I talk about geometry, I mean the geometry of the cross-section of the tokamak, so the sort of slightly D shape that you see on the left figure. So this image might be even more explicit. So this is the inside of a fusion chamber during a fusion reaction. So the visible light corresponds to colder areas of the plasma, otherwise you don't really see much of it. And so the geometry we're talking about will be these D shapes that delimit the core where the magnetic field lines are closed, as opposed to outside of these D shapes where the magnetic field lines are not closed. So the physics is very different, and we're really focusing on the core physics. I might be using the words poloidal and toroidal later in the presentation. So poloidal means turning inside of that D-shaped cross-section, and toroidal means revolutions around the central axis of the reactor. So the model we use to describe the plasma, there are several available, but what we use is called gyrokinetics. So it's based on the Vlasov equation, which is a transport equation in a 6-dimension phase space. So the gradient here is not, the divergence here is not just in 3D, but in 6D. With on the right-hand side, so there can be collisions or heat sources or various other terms. One of the key tricks of gyrokinetics is to eliminate the fastest time scale of movement. So instead of describing the trajectory of the particle, it's a helicoidal movement around the magnetic field line. You only follow the position of the center of that rotation on the field line, then the parallel velocity along the field line, and the magnetic moment. So that would be basically the radius of the field line, but you average over the actual angle of the rotation to get rid of this very fast physics that can be difficult to simulate. So you obtain the 5-dimensional gyrokinetic average Vlasov equation that you have here. That looks essentially the same in terms of properties. And magnetized plasmas that are described by gyrokinetic are host to many types of instabilities given the reservoirs of free energy that you can have in gradients of density, temperature, or current. It's a problem over many scales, many orders of magnitudes for both space and time, be it for the because of the movement of the ions themselves, the electrons, and the various physics that are taking place inside of the reactor. And of course, you're going to have, being a fluid, you're going to have turbulence, which is going to be made even more complex because of some kinetic fixtures related to magnetic confinement or fast particle, etc. So magnetic shaping is a topic that is known from theory to have an influence on the quality of the confinement, so how quickly the heat is going to escape from the core of the plasma towards the outside. In particular, it's known that elongation, so the height divided by the width, can be very good at increasing the confinement. And a few tokamaks can actually modify their magnetic equilibrium geometry using external coils, which allow them to probe this. So it's not just theory, it has also been studied. And in addition to the influence of ellipticity that has been known for a while, so elongation, triangularity, and in particular negative triangularity, has been the topic of a lot of research in recent times. So negative triangularity, I'm not sure if you see my mouse or not, but on the bottom left, positive triangularity would be the red cross section, so where the belly of the D is toward the outside of the tokamak, and the blue one would be the negative triangularity, where the belly of the D is towards the inside, so toward the magnetic axis. Now when it comes to GYSELA and the implementation of geometry that we are taking care of, so GYSELA stands for gyrokinetic semi-Lagrangian, so reference to its core scheme for the time integration. So it's a code that has been developed for about 20 years now, mainly in our research lab in IRFM in the CA of Cadarache. But also relies on strong collaborations between physicists, mathematicians, and computer scientists, so in Germany, in Switzerland, and in France. So some key points of GYSELA are the fact that it's a global code. So it's the fact that you have the whole cross-section and the whole plasma that is simulated, as opposed to local codes, which might only look at a small area, either a small window inside of the plasma, or that might be considering a hollowed out torus and not have the center of the torus or the outside and just a very thin layer. So this one is global. It's full F and flux driven. So it's a reference to the fact that although the model is essentially an expansion around a Maxwellian equilibrium, we also take into account the fact that the Maxwellian can be evolving and don't only consider small variation around the equilibrium we started from. It supports multiple ion species, so that can be very interesting for the study of impurities that are scraped off the wall and can pollute the plasma and lead to a loss of heat. It includes a collision operator, so for various types of physics, not just turbulent transport. So the last point about a full kinetic or trapped kinetic electron is about models for the electrons. So it's not something I'm going to detail too much, but I would just say that fully kinetic electrons are basically electrons that are simulated completely, as opposed to other models that allow emulating electrons and thus reducing the amount of computation that has been done, because if you follow the electrons in detail, you also need a time scale that is much, much smaller to follow their fast movements. So the recent developments around GYSELA include study of electromagnetic effects. Having a variation of the magnetic field, which is otherwise fixed, it will be fixed in what I'm presenting here. Study of realistic magnetic configuration. So this is the current presentation, and more realistic boundaries, since typical boundary condition from mathematics, so Dirichlet condition, etc., are not really applicable in such context. And so more advanced models are actively studied using GYSELA. So in the standard regime, in the basic type of simulation that could be run for production run in GYSELA, the turbulence is going to develop at the ion scales. So the 5D mesh might have about 1 trillion points, and the simulation has to run for a few million iterations. So that's a total of flops around or of the order of 10 to the 20. So that would be a few days at the petascale. However, moving towards improved confinement regimes, the ions are already stabilized, and so the turbulence that we want to study is moved to the much smaller scale of electrons, which requires refining the time scale and the perpendicular scale, so the scales in the cross section, by a factor which is of the order of the ratio of the mass of deuterium over the mass of electrons, so a factor of about 60. And in that case, the number of flops for such simulation is moved to something of the order of 10 to the 25, which would be 100 days on exascale. So that's why we have a lot of interest in improving the parallelization of the code and adding new methods to follow the advancement of the physics that we also want to study. So the plot on the bottom show some weak scaling tests. So that's increasing the resolution of the mesh at the same time as you're increasing the number of cores to avoid getting to a point where there's no point increasing the number of cores anymore. And as you can see, GYSELA behaves quite well up to of the order of 500,000 cores. So coming now to the changes that are being undertaken with this geometry. So geometry is something that is normally computed at the very beginning of the simulation, since as I briefly mentioned earlier, the magnetic configuration doesn't evolve over time. So it is going to be what defines our mesh. And so far it was a simplified concentric circular configuration. Then once this is determined, we are going to solve the Vlasov equation, which is going to give us the time evolution of the distribution of plasma in phase space, together with the Poisson equation, which is going to be used to update the electric field within the simulation, and that appears in the Vlasov equation. Now, with these changes, there are many aspects here that have been modified. So one point is that we do not assume anymore that the mesh is equidistant. So this is not because of the geometry itself. It's an additional decision that our initial r theta mesh is not necessarily equidistant. So as I was saying, it's not a simplified circular concentric grid anymore. Inside of the Vlasov equation or the collision operator or the diagnostics and many other parts of the code, there has to be addition of the metric and taking into account the fact that some vectors might not be orthogonal anymore. So that's a lot of small work that that has to be done and tested. And the main change, the main issue of the change is what you have at the bottom, the change to the Poisson solver, because the previous one relied on a Fourier transform in theta and in phi, which simplified a lot the resolution, but is not an option anymore now that the metric also depends on theta. So this is one of the issues we have at the moment, that update of the Poisson solver, which is the part that is still a work in progress. So to give you a bit more detail on that progress, so the computation of the magnetic field, the update of the code to include the metrics, etc., is already something that is available. The new Poisson solver, which is completely new, it's not an update of the previous one, but really a different solver, is still underway. So it's already working for so the so-called kinetic electrons. That's what I mentioned earlier. They are fully simulated electrons. So it's already available for physical simulations. However, kinetic electrons also have a computational cost that is very, very expensive because of the orders of magnitude that I mentioned earlier. And so this is why in this presentation I don't have so many results to show, just a few because of that cost, and we can't make really very large simulations, or it would be a lot of cost, I would say, wasted, while we could just wait to have the next step ready. So for the geometry itself, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about the equations, but the general form of our cross-section is defined as shown on the screen with the two equations for R, which is the axis, and Z, which is the vertical axis. So it's an approximate solution to the Grad-Schaffanoff equation, which governs the magnetic field in equilibrium configuration. so the Coulomb equilibrium we use reduces this 2D problem or 3D problem into a set of 1D differential equations that are simply integrated and give us an expression for these E or T, etc. That you have in the expression here. So on the bottom right, you have an actual example of what the geometry look like. I have more to show on the next slide, but this is just to give an idea of the general shapes that we're talking about. So in terms of degrees of freedom, you can freely choose the elongation. So again, the height over the width, the triangularity, which is what takes you towards this D shape, starting from an elliptic shape. You can specify other profiles, such as the pressure profile, the equilibrium pressure profile, or the safety factor, which allows to determine how exactly the evolution from one field light to the next one, are they going to be very dense at a point or very or not, and other parameters like this. So the orderings of the derivation are going to constrain the geometries that are available. But in our case, there's no problem in going into the realistic ones, such as ITER or WEST. WEST being the fusion reactor that we have in CEA here, in Cadarache. So here you have 3 examples of such cross-sections. So with a positive triangularity, so that D shape with the belly on the right, no triangularity, or with a negative one. So there's also the Schaffner shift that makes the center not be exactly at the center. And so the black curve would be the edge of the domain in each case, with the outer one, the blue one, used for those extended boundary conditions that we study. So for the validation test, so as I was saying, given the fact that it's still in development, I don't have so many nice plots to show to illustrate what is working. It's mostly unit tests, so test of conservation properties with the new geometry. Noting that the circular geometry generated by the Coulomb equilibrium is not the same as the one we had before. There are also tests on the accuracy of the new Poisson solver. So you, over just one step, you take a very high resolution solution, and then you try to reduce the resolution and see exactly how close you are. So that's what you have at the bottom left, and you can see that spline, which is the new solver, is actually slightly more accurate than the previous one, which, to be honest, was a surprise. But it's a rather good thing. And on the right, you have a more physically relevant simulation. So it's called GAM dumping. So where you have this oscillation that have an exponential envelope and are supposed to converge towards a non-zero limit. So with the previous solver in blue and the new solver in orange. And another very positive aspect of this simulation is that we found that the new solver, although it uses an iterative solver for matrix inversion, actually doesn't cost us any increased computation time. And it's time now for the summary. So we are still upgrading the code GYSELA to allow simulation in D-shaped magnetic configurations. So that required a major modification throughout the code. In all aspects. We now have a magnetic configuration with elongation, triangularity, Schaffner shift, and other physical property of interest. And the general Poisson solver, which is being implemented from scratch, is already available, but only for kinetic electrons, so very costly simulation, and is currently being extended towards so-called adiabatic electrons to allow ease up a bit the computational load. And early validation tests showed good performance, so good conservation properties, good performance in terms of accuracy and in terms of time computational load. Yes. And that's it for me. So thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kévin. So we are opening questions. Ulrich, did you have anything?
Yeah, Kévin, so thanks for the nice presentation. So in terms of the Poisson solver, we did have that conversation with Eric Sonnendrücke and a few days ago.
Yes.
So did I understand correctly that you're using the Poisson solver on the cross sections or on the full 3D tokamak?
each cross section can be solved independently in the current state of GYSELA. So it's a 2D problem solved as many times as we have cross sections.
So the solver that you're using is then CG based, right? So as we've discussed with Eric.
Yes.
Okay, so this will not be scalable. You're aware of that. CG cannot be scalable on the Poisson equation.
Yes. So that's actually one of the main issues, depending on presentation, including the presentation. I already had a slide for you, but I didn't mention at all in this presentation the fact that computation time is one of the issues we have.
Yeah,
yes.
but going for a Poisson solver, there is all the knowledge about multigrid that you cannot beat multigrid with a CG solver.
Yes, on the long run, GYSELA will be probably updated to much more refined solvers. But as for my own research, so with EoCoE2, basically the choice of that solver in particular was already made when I arrived. So on the short term and for the present presentation, I'm using this particular solver. But I'm sure for the long run, on a few more years, GYSELA will be moving towards multi-grid. But of course, if the rest of the code, if we only update the Poisson solver for multi-grid, but not the rest of the code, it doesn't have so much interest probably. So that's why it's a rather longer term objective.
I completely agree, right? So and then I also understand that the Poisson solver only takes a certain fraction of the overall compute time. But I'm just saying it's a strategically wrong decision to go for a CG solver. It has to be done such that you can use a multigrid, because otherwise in the long run you will go into a deadlock. It is a one-way street. You cannot get out of that.
Yes, so for the circular case, we know that we don't have that the cost is still acceptable, but as soon as you're not circular, the cost can be much higher. I guess we excite some other modes. Some more complex modes, and so yeah, it's still a study that I'm trying to make, but for now that's what I have. So.
Okay, all right, thanks, and sorry for being very explicit here, but you know, this has been my field of work for 25 years, so
yeah,
I think
sure,
I know what
no
I'm
problem.
talking about.
Of course, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Rich. And don't worry about being frank on these matters. I think this is very much where these kind of meetings are for. So. Okay, is there anyone else? If not, Kévin, thank you once again.
Thank you.
We will now have a 15-minute break, so we should reconvene at 11 and 5. And we will start with Florian Dupuis' presentation. So have a nice break, everyone, and talk to you in 15 minutes.